The scripture reading today is from the letter of James. James is insistent that faith is not just about what you believe, but about how you live. He has some harsh words for those who are not generous with others. James believes in action. And yet, he also encourages patience, just humbly waiting for the grace of God. From James 5, verses 7 and 8. Be patient, therefore, beloved, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious crop from the earth, being patient with it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also must be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Thanks be to God for these words of life.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest that there are some things in this world that are not quite as we want them to be. There are some things wrong with this world. Am I right? Yeah. You want to mention some of them, maybe? Now, recognizing that there are people in this room whom you love who are Republicans, and there are people in this room who you love who are Democrats, and yet wanting to be honest with each other, what are some of the things in this world that are not right now? Reduction of food stamp program. I don't want to have to repeat them all, so try to talk loud enough so others can hear you. Lack of compassion. Education. What was back there? I heard climate up here and something back there. Okay. What kind of inequality? Huge inequality. I heard gun violence. Lack of kindness and gentleness. Polarization. Yeah. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer, right? That's quite a list. And of course, we could go on with much more. The way I asked the question, I sort of led you to mention big picture social issues, but of course those aren't the only things that are wrong with the world right now. Knowing that our world includes us, includes things that are wrong with our lives. Anybody willing to venture in that direction? What's wrong with our lives these days?
Patience and understanding.
Need for patience and understanding. Busyness, yeah.
Health, job loss.
Health, job loss, that's so real.
My body's falling apart.
That might be a little more extreme version of health and illness. Got to keep the pieces together, Craig. Fear. Lack of compassion. Strained family relations as we are here between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So we certainly experience that these days. There's so much more, right? Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. That's what the world is made of these days, my friends. There's a lot of tough stuff out there. There's a lot of tough stuff in the world, big picture, social things, and there's a lot of tough stuff in our lives, which are also big, although perhaps more personal. One of the themes in the Bible that I think we sometimes miss is that those two groups of things, those social things and those personal things, are more closely related than we often think. The great problems of the world, war, hunger, racism, inequality, lack of kindness, civility, lack of access to healthcare and education, all of those things, the big problems of the world are the big problems of the world because they affect individuals, because they are very personal to someone. In our little, very little, corner of this world, we have mostly protected ourselves from the effects of those things. But wow, people suffer in this world. You know the plural of anecdote, right? Statistics. It's interesting to me, though, that when we name the big things, we tend to name things that affect other people. It's not exclusively true, but we tend to do this. We tend to name things that affect other people, things over which we have compassion for other people. But we're not so good at naming the big things that affect us personally. Maybe we got a little bit of that earlier. If I left more time, and if we were all more comfortable being vulnerable with each other, someone could well have mentioned anxiety, for instance. It's a real and common issue in our society today, in our community today. Someone in our church who manages school psychologists in the area says that children as young as 6 now are being diagnosed with anxiety disorder. The United States has twice the use of antidepressants as Norway. And yet, we are not too good at naming the corrosive effects of advertising or the moral injury of income inequality as being among the things that are wrong with our world. When you consider that here, with the most technologically advanced healthcare system in the world, death rates for middle-aged men are increasing, rising, it's fair to say that those types of things are literally killing us. I have a niece who has been teaching English in Angola for the past 6 months, and while there, she has lost something like 35 pounds over 6 months. Not because of any lack of food, but because in a lot of ways, she's in a much more healthy social environment without many of the weirdnesses about weight and appearance and beauty that we have in our culture. We are quick to see weight as a personal issue, but not so quick to see it as one of the corrosive effects of what's going on in our society. Now, through our work with DuPage United, I was at a meeting recently with Jim Skogsberg, the CEO of Advocate Aurora Healthcare, the biggest private employer in Illinois. And we asked him what he sees as being the biggest issues in healthcare going forward. The 2 issues that he mentioned were mental health and the social determinants of health, especially among those who have experienced trauma, and especially among the poor. That means gun violence, poverty, domestic violence, bullying, and so many more forms of trauma. the social and the personal are deeply, deeply connected. So all of that stuff that you mentioned earlier, both the personal and the social, the persocial, honestly, it makes me mad. It makes me mad. I see so much of it as tied together. It's obvious that war kills children whose parents grieve. Climate change leads to more powerful storms, which leads to more deaths, which leads to more grieving. Toxic masculinity keeps men in our society from dealing constructively with bad feelings, and the suicide rate among 40-something-year-old men is higher than ever. White supremacy subtly is tolerated among political leaders, and so Muslim kids get bullied, and that leads to trauma, it leads to suffering, and sometimes 18-year-olds, in the crazy thoughts of their minds, take military-style weapons and open fire in schools, and people grieve. The social and the personal, the persocial, it's deeply, deeply connected. And so much of it makes me mad. Of course, I'm not the only one to feel this way. This is the kind of tone that exists in the letter of James. The letter of James is a prophetic proclamation of the connection of the personal and the social in the world of the New Testament. James acknowledges that the poor are suffering because the rich have oppressed them, but it's not left at the level of vague, broad income inequality. It's left at the level of personal impacts upon people in their community who are suffering. The number one response of humans to this situation in much of human history has been violence, right? People take up arms, they beat their plowshares into swords and their pruning hooks into AK-47s, and they take up arms against their oppressors. However, Jesus told his disciples to put away their swords, for such is not the way of God. The other great response in human history may be more reflective of our own lives. We have let the reality of violence be far away, distant from us in so many ways. The other response to this situation of persocial trouble in the world is to acquiesce to it, to let it be, to stand by the side and watch it go by on television, maybe feel bad about it, maybe rant about it, but ultimately not act. These two directions, though, the New Testament makes clear, are never acceptable. We cannot take up arms or support those who do, and we cannot sit back and wait. We cannot sit back and do nothing, but rather perhaps we can find a better way to wait. I'm going to read for you again now the passage that Kathy read earlier. And I got to admit, when Kathy read earlier, I suspect it came across as maybe not the most fascinating passage in the world because you didn't have the context. But when you think of the context as the troubles of this world, as the very real persocial ills that affect us and those we love and the world in which we live, when you get a little bit of that anger going inside, then you can hear this passage properly. To read it in what is maybe a little different translation. Be far from violent rage, sisters and brothers, until the presence of the Lord. The field worker waits for the precious yield of the earth, not forcing it, but waiting for the early and the late rains. Be far from violent rage and steady your heart, for the presence of the Lord is near. This is, I believe, a way for James to say, don't just do something, stand there. Don't just lash out in violence, but also don't just sit there, but wait, active waiting in the name of Jesus Christ, who is coming into this world to intervene and show us the way to set it right. The way of compassion and love and care and active living out of our faith for the sake of the world and the way that the world's problems affect us each and every day. Active waiting. That's the way of Jesus Christ. It's the way of waiting that you might think of for, well, the image that's used here in the book of James. It's the way that a farmer waits. A farmer can't force the crops to grow out of the ground. A farmer has to wait for the gifts of the sun and the rain and the soil and time. And the earth brings forth its fruit. That's actively waiting. It's the waiting that you might think of as an older brother waits for his younger brother to put up together a stack of blocks, where the 4-year-old child can be proud of what he has done. The older brother could have intervened and done it for him, but he actively waited for that little brother to do the task. That is active waiting. It's the way a spouse waits for a loved one with trouble with alcohol to be ready to get the help they need. You can't intervene and make that happen, but you can actively wait for the person to be ready to get help. When we look at this world and the problems that we face, we think about Christmas and what does it mean? What does it have to do with these problems that we face? It means that we take the one who came to us at Christmas, who is coming into the world at Christmas, and we follow his way to do what we need to do in the world. The active waiting that is required to let God's way win. It's the way of love and compassion and peace and joy, these words that we see at Christmas time: love, peace, joy, hope. That's how we actively wait in the world. And now, because there is too little active waiting in the world, because we are so fast to jump in and do something and fix something, either violently or otherwise, or because we are so quick to acquiesce, to do nothing, to let the ways of this world stand, we're going to practice now. We're going to practice with, get this, my friends, 3 minutes of actively waiting. I want you to actively wait in quiet with a little twinkling on the keys in the background. Actively wait in your heart so that the way of God can fill you and you can go to make a difference in this world. If something comes into your mind during this time that you don't want to be there, Grant taught me a little trick. Imagine that you're on the side of a river and there's a boat going by, and you can just place that unwanted thought in your mind. You can place it there in the boat and let the boat carry on down the river. If you are clearing your mind and clearing your soul in these 3 minutes, God will find a way into your life in this crazy busy time where we can not just do something, but stand here, seated here in the presence of God, to be filled with the way of God in our lives for the sake of this world. Thanks be to God.